Hi, my name is Melisha, and I'm going to be discussing if culture have an impact on aging and cognition. As we age, we see decrease in biological cognitive functions, such as decrease in working memory, decrease in reasoning, and this is evident across all cultures. However, culturally based cognition is preserved with age because of prolonged practice. This brings to my thesis statement, stating that during a cognitive task where there is high need on using new strategies, older adults' performance will decrease due to high cognitive demands. However, if the cognitive task is culturally biased, then the elders from one culture will outperform elders from another culture due to sustained practice of the task. And this is my evidence to support my thesis statement. Okay, so in evidence one, I looked at categorical organization in free recall across culture and age by Gutchers and colleagues. They predicted that Americans exhibit a larger use of categories than Easterners, and the use is magnified for American elderly because it's a well practiced strategy. The purpose was to investigate the cross cultural difference in categorical organization, and they used 112 young and 112 elderly from both American and Chinese culture. Okay, so they conducted two experiments. Experiment number one was using high frequency words, and experiment two using low frequency words. So participants had to study 20 words, and after 20 words, they did a retention interval task, and then they had to recall the words in any order. And this was the same for experiment number two by using low frequency words. Using ACR scores, they measure clustering, 1 being perfect clustering and 0 being clustering at a level of chance. So for results, experiment 1, where there was high frequency words, elderly Chinese did not show clustering categorization. However, elderly Americans did use this strategy to recall words. And this was the same for experiment 2, where elderly Americans did use categorization to recall words, however, elderly Chinese did not. So, results can be interpreted by noting that categorization is a well practiced cultural strategy and the prolonged use of it can be used to overcome biological declines, and this is what we see in American elderly. And for Chinese elderly, um, since they do have biological declines where they have reduced working memory and processing speed, it's harder to implement this categorical organization. However, young Chinese adults, since they have enough cognitive resources, they can still implement this strategy and improve their performance in word recall. For evidence two, I looked at when age and culture interact in an easy and yet cognitively demanding task. Older adults, but now young adults, showed the expected cultural difference. This was done by Huang and colleagues. If I was to ask you whether a dog is a mammal or a whale is a mammal, you're much likely to answer that a dog is a mammal much faster than if a whale is a mammal. This is because of the typicality effect. East Asian people are intuitive in reasoning, so they are more prone to typicality effect than Americans. And in order to inhibit this typicality effect, it takes higher cognitive resources. And this is harder for older adults because they do not have these cognitive resources as they age. The purpose of the study was to investigate cultural difference in intuitive reasoning, and the participants that were used were 105 Americans and 98 Singaporeans. The procedure for this study was categorizing living animals and non living animals. So it is easier to categorize typical living organisms that are animate, like a bear, and it's harder to categorize atypical living organisms like seaweed. So each word was shown for 3 seconds and followed by a 500 millisecond fixation. For evidence two, I looked at when age and culture interact in an easy and yet cognitively demanding task. Older adults, but no young adults, showed the expected cultural difference. This was done by Huang and colleagues. If I was to ask you whether a dog is a mammal or a whale is a mammal, you're much likely to answer that a dog is a mammal much faster than if a whale is a mammal. This is because of the typicality effect. East Asian people are intuitive in reasoning, so they are more prone to typicality effect than Americans. And in order to inhibit this typicality effect, it takes higher cognitive resources. And this is harder for older adults because they do not have these cognitive resources as they age. The purpose of the study was to investigate cultural difference in intuitive reasoning, and the participants that were used were 105 Americans and 98 Singaporeans. The procedure for this study was categorizing living animals and non living animals. So it is easier to categorize typical living organisms that are animate, like a bear, and it's harder to categorize atypical living organisms like seaweed. So each word was shown for 3 seconds and followed by a 500 millisecond fixation. Results show that Singaporean older adults had a longer reaction time categorizing inanimate objects than American elderly. There was no difference in reaction time for young adults in inanimate or animate living objects. The results from this study can be used to support my thesis statement. It showed that if you have enough cognitive resources, like the young Singaporean adults did, you can overcome this typicality effect. However, without enough cognitive resources, typicality effect is shown, and so this is what we see in older Singaporean adults that have a harder time inhibiting this effect. For my last study, I used thinking more holistically as we grow older, results from a different task in two cultures by Zhang and colleagues to support my thesis statement. Holistic thinking is more common with East Asians than Westerners, and holistic thinking is thinking that everything in the world is interconnected. So we can predict that East Asian people are more likely to pay attention to contextual information, and older Asian adults would have a greater holistic thinking than young adults due to culture playing a role in development of holistic thinking. The purpose of the study was to investigate cultural difference in holistic thinking. The participants that were used were 42 young adults and 42 old adults in Chinese sample, and 43 young adults and 47 old adults in the American sample. The procedures used were two different experiments. So the first experiment was dialectic self-scale, which measured the self-reported holistic thinking style. So participants were asked questions like, when I hear an argument, I often agree, or I often find that my beliefs and attitudes will change under different contexts. Okay, so the second one was the frame line task. It was used to measure contextual information. It was used to see if different contexts could influence the judgment of the second line. For results in experiment 1, self reported dialectic thinking, Chinese adults use more dialectic thinking than American participants, which is what we expected because East Asian cultures use holistic thinking. But what is surprising is that older Chinese adults showed less dialectic thinking than young Chinese adults. And for experiment number 2, frame line task, older Chinese adults show more holistic thinking than young Chinese adults, and no observable difference in American sample was seen. Finally, these experimental results can also be used to support my thesis statement, as we see that older Chinese adults were more likely to use contextual information in performing the line task and engage more in holistic thinking when doing the self measured than American older adults. Okay, finally concluding my presentation, in all three studies, I show that cognitive tasks that are culturally practiced are resistant to aging. In study 1, categorical organization is harder for Chinese adults. In study 2, typicality effect was shown more in older Singaporean adults. And in study 3, Holistic thinking was used in Chinese elderly because this was the dominant way of thinking in Chinese culture.